As Joe Biden's presidency comes to an end, after withdrawing from the upcoming November elections, now is a good time to reflect on his term and look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. Biden's approval rating steadily tanked throughout his term and hit an all-time low for him at 37%. The writing has been on the wall for some time. The severity of Biden's incompetence has been consistently highlighted since October with his disastrous handling, supplying, and enabling of Israel's genocide on Gaza. However, I want to make one thing clear. Biden being forced out of the race had nothing to do with Gaza. It has nothing to do with all of us who had been set on abandoning Biden come November. It had nothing to do with an overwhelming majority of Democrats supporting a ceasefire, or 64% that believe Israel is committing war crimes against Palestinian civilians. It has nothing to do with any of the pressure Muslim Americans and young voters put on Biden in protests, on college campuses, or anywhere else.
Hey Joe Biden, you will see. Palestine will be free. Biden, you can't hide. Biden, you can't hide. We charge you with genocide. We charge you with genocide.
After the infamous debate with Trump, Biden's own party turned on him, and along with the media, shamelessly dragged him in humiliating fashion relentlessly.
Well, I think consistent with your reaction, Rachel, and others on the panel, it's kind of a DEFCON 1 moment.
Right now, as we speak, there is a deep, a wide, and a very aggressive panic in the Democratic Party.
Biden started by holding a meeting with Democratic governors where he addressed concerns about his health, stating he was fine, but then adding, "It's just my brain."
Donors lost confidence in him after his bad debate performance and pulled the plug. Then, the DNC practically performed a coup. With his dropping approval rating, constant blunders, and lack of enthusiasm from voters across the board, this was probably inevitable. What is ironic about this is that the cognitive decline and mental inabilities of Biden were pointed out months before that debate, and were met with outrage and defense of Biden by Democrats, their supporters, Biden himself, and even Kamala Harris. It was considered ageist to point this out, and many prominent Democrats and media outlets defended Biden for months shamelessly.
The way that the president's demeanor in that report was characterized could not be more wrong on the facts.
This report is misguided both in its conclusion and its excessive editorializing.
I think there was a lot in that report that was unnecessary. It may be true, but still unnecessary, and it saddens me.
I agree with President Biden's reaction, which was absolutely outrageous.
The gratuitous comments that respected experts are saying is out of line are inappropriate. And they shouldn't distract from the fact that the case is closed.
They all lied to the nation about Biden's cognitive abilities, and now not only act as if that never happened, but they have the gall to point out Trump's mental state and age negatively, as if they were not defending a corpse last month.
Can you say that you were honest with the American people about what you saw in those moments with President Biden as you were with him again and again, repeatedly in that time?
Of course. Joe Biden is an extremely accomplished, experienced, and capable in every way that anyone would want if they're president.
And you never saw anything like what happened at the debate night behind closed doors with him?
It was a bad debate. People have bad debates. He is absolutely.
But that's the reason why you're here, and he's not running for the top of the ticket.
You met with him at least once a week for 3.5 years. You didn't have any concerns?
I think the American people have a concern about Donald Trump.
The main point I'm trying to make here is that although Biden will be remembered for his unwavering support of Israel's genocide on Gaza, it is not the reason for him being pushed aside. It is also important to understand that Biden fought tooth and nail to stay in, and this strange notion that Democrats have deployed of attempting to salvage Biden's legacy by painting him as some sort of martyr or hero for being pushed aside is pathetic, misleading, and insulting. What do you guys think about the way that Biden dropped out? I personally think maybe he could have stayed in, but
I think it was incredibly honorable and brave of him, and he'll go down in history as a great president for that.
He was beyond fucked.
We had a little debate last week. Can't say it was my best performance.
We love it, Joe. We
But ever since then, there's been a lot of speculation. What's Joe going to do? Is he going to stay in the race? Is he going to drop out? What's he going to do? Well, here's my answer. I am running and going to win again. I'm the sitting president of the United States of America in no small part because of you. I'm the nominee of the Democratic Party. I'm the nominee of this party because millions of Democrats like you just voted for me in primaries all across America. You voted for me to be your nominee. No one else. You, the voters did that. And despite that some folks don't seem to care who you voted for, well, guess what? They're trying to push me out of the race. Well, let me say this as clearly as I can. I'm staying in the race.
He made some good points there, and this ages poorly on behalf of the Democratic Party especially.
I'm not leaving.
I'm not fucking leaving. The show goes on. This is my home. They're gonna need a fucking wrecking ball to take me out of here. They're gonna need to send in the National Guard or fucking SWAT team, because I ain't going nowhere. Fuck them.
When Joe Biden took office in January 2021, he faced an array of formidable challenges that would test any new administration. The nation was reeling from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, overwhelmed healthcare systems, and caused severe economic disruption. The pandemic had led to widespread unemployment and business closures, creating an urgent need for comprehensive economic recovery plans. Biden's inauguration came on the heels of the January 6th Capitol riot, a stark reminder of the deep political divisions within the country. This event underscored the urgent need for healing and unity, themes that Biden emphasized in his early speeches. His administration was tasked with not only addressing the immediate crisis and problems, but also restoring faith in democratic institutions. One of Biden's primary focuses was the vaccination campaign to control the spread of COVID-19. He set ambitious targets for vaccine distribution and implemented measures to support states in their efforts to vaccinate their populations. Alongside these public health efforts, Biden introduced economic relief packages like the American Rescue Plan Act, which was aimed at helping individuals and businesses weather the ongoing financial storm. Biden's early days in office were marked by a sense of urgency and a flurry of executive actions designed to address pressing issues. His administration moved quickly to rejoin international agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord, signaling a shift in policy direction from the previous administration. Domestically, he sought to advance his agenda on infrastructure, healthcare, and social justice. Initially, it seemed like a decent change of pace from the previous administration. However, despite the initial optimism and support reflected in his 57% approval rating, Biden's presidency soon encountered significant hurdles. He didn't do himself any favors either. From a visceral perspective, he was a poor speaker, often coming off as dull rather than sharp. He was also very stubborn when it came to things like foreign policy, with a headstrong approach to America's contain China policy and lacking the will to support stability across Asia and the Middle East, not to mention ironclad support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. As Biden's term progressed, it became clear that not only was he an unfit president, but a terrible excuse for a president. But to be fair, it was not all bad. Biden's presidency was initially marked by a calmer tone compared to Trump's, a focus on significant legislation, efforts to promote inclusiveness, drive economic recovery, and heal the divisiveness within the country by appealing to the center-right who were vocal about their abhorrence towards Trump, the so-called never-Trumpers. At the same time, his platform was praised as one of the most progressive at the time. It still stands as the most progressive American presidential term to date. The bar is in hell, but it's still true. Biden's administration passed a lot of good legislation. Some of it was not only good, but monumental. On his first day in office, Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement, signaling a renewed commitment to addressing climate change and restoring U.S. leadership in global environmental efforts. This move set ambitious targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and aimed for a net zero emissions economy by 2050. It sent a message to both domestic and international stakeholders that the United States was serious about transitioning to a more sustainable, climate-resilient future.
Dr. Fauci, give us vaccines. Help all the people who have been quarantined. We'll wear our masks and we'll have to stay distant. We'll wash our hands and we'll be more resistant.
Biden's administration successfully rolled out COVID-19 vaccines, achieving the goal of administering 200 million doses within its first 100 days. This significantly increased vaccination rates, helping control the spread of the virus and saving lives. I think it's also important to understand, unlike the rejoining of the Paris Agreement, which is in complete contrast to the previous administration, some successes that Biden had, like the COVID rollout, should be credited, but it's also important to recognize that Trump deserves equal credit for all his administration did for the development and funding of the vaccines, with Operation Warp Speed and FDA emergency use authorization. While Biden's administration was responsible for the large-scale rollout and administration of the vaccines, especially during the initial 100 days, the Trump administration played a critical role in the development, funding, and early authorization of the vaccines. It set the stage for the success of the vaccine distribution by securing funding, speeding up vaccine development, and securing emergency approvals.
Print money. The number's going down. It's not supposed to happen. What's going on? Don't worry, I got a solution. What's that?
The American Rescue Plan Act is a $1.9 trillion economic relief package that provided direct payments of $1,400 to eligible individuals, extended unemployment benefits, and expanded the child tax credit. It allocated significant funds to state and local governments, schools, and COVID-19 testing and vaccination efforts, aiming to stabilize the economy and support struggling Americans. This was the second largest relief package behind Trump's CARES Act. President Biden enhanced the Affordable Care Act by increasing subsidies through the American Rescue Plan Act, significantly lowering premiums and out-of-pocket costs for many families. The American Rescue Plan Act ensured that no one pays more than 8.5% of their household income on health insurance premiums, making coverage more affordable. The Biden administration also opened a special enrollment period in 2021, allowing nearly 3 million Americans to newly sign up for coverage, which, combined with an extended open enrollment period, boosted enrollment numbers to a record 14.5 million. These efforts led to a substantial reduction in the uninsured rate, which dropped from 10.3% in late 2020 to 8.9% by the third quarter of 2021. The enhancements made healthcare more accessible, especially during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and provided significant financial relief for households. By increasing income eligibility for subsidies and reducing premiums, the administration expanded access to affordable health insurance and improved healthcare affordability for millions of Americans. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that marks one of the most significant investments in American infrastructure in decades. This comprehensive legislation includes $550 billion in new federal spending allocated to improve roads, bridges, and major projects, as well as public transit, rail, airports, ports, and water systems. Key highlights of the act include $110 billion for roads, bridges, and major infrastructure projects, making it the largest investment in repairing and reconstructing the nation's bridges since the construction of the interstate highway system. Additionally, $39 billion is dedicated to modernizing public transit, aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve accessibility for all Americans, especially those in underserved communities. The act also addresses clean water infrastructure by investing $55 billion to expand access to clean drinking water and eliminate lead service lines in homes, schools, and child care centers across the country. Moreover, the legislation includes $65 billion to ensure every American has access to reliable high-speed internet, lowering broadband costs for consumers. In terms of sustainability, the bill provides $7.5 billion for building a national network of EV chargers and $5 billion for replacing school buses with zero-emission vehicles, contributing to the reduction of air pollution and promoting clean energy. The act also invests $66 billion in passenger and freight rail, representing the largest investment in rail since the creation of Amtrak. Overall, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is designed to create millions of good-paying union jobs, improve the nation's competitiveness, and address long-standing infrastructure deficiencies, thereby fostering sustainable and equitable economic growth for decades to come. President Biden has been a strong advocate for labor unions, consistently promoting policies that support workers' rights to organize and engage in collective bargaining. His administration has actively reversed several Trump-era regulations that weakened union protections, thereby restoring and strengthening labor rights. One of Biden's key legislative endorsements has been the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or PRO Act, which aims to significantly enhance workers' abilities to form and join unions without employer interference. The administration's commitment to labor extends to supporting project labor agreements and prevailing wage standards on federal projects, ensuring that workers receive fair compensation. Biden also reestablished the White House Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment, chaired by VP Kamala Harris, to promote union membership and collective bargaining across federal agencies and private sector workplaces. Additionally, Biden has been vocal about increasing the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour, a move that aligns with his broader labor agenda to reduce income inequality and improve living standards for low-wage workers. His administration is also focused on improving workplace safety and expanding protections for gig and contract workers, ensuring they receive benefits and protections similar to traditional employees. His administration has also sought to make it easier for federal workers to join unions by overturning previous restrictions and enhancing collective bargaining rights. By prioritizing labor rights and advocating for stronger unions, Biden aims to empower workers, promote fair wages, and ensure safe and equitable working conditions across the United States. The Biden administration placed a strong emphasis on promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, otherwise known as DEIA, across federal agencies while simultaneously advancing racial equity and supporting underserved communities through several key executive orders. These initiatives were designed to make the federal workforce and government policies more reflective of the diverse American population and more responsive to the needs of historically marginalized groups. The Biden administration's approach to DEIA sharply contrasts with the Trump administration's policies, particularly in the realm of reversing actions that undermined DEIA efforts. For instance, Biden revoked Trump's Executive Order 13950 on combating race and sex stereotyping, which prohibited certain diversity training in federal agencies that addressed concepts like systemic racism and implicit bias. Biden's Executive Order 13985 replaced it, directing federal agencies to advance racial equity and support underserved communities. Additionally, Biden reversed Trump's transgender military ban with Executive Order 14004, which restored the rights of transgender individuals to serve openly in the U.S. military. He also reinstated protections for LGBTQ+ individuals that were rolled back during the Trump era, such as guidance on transgender students' rights in schools through Executive Order 13988. These actions highlight Biden's commitment to promoting a more inclusive and equitable society, undoing policies that were seen as regressive under the Trump administration, and implementing new measures to foster diversity and combat discrimination across all sectors of government and society. Biden also deserves credit for the many other executive orders he signed to help in this regard. The Biden administration oversaw a period of significant economic recovery and job growth during 2021 to 2022, marked by the creation of millions of jobs and a sharp drop in unemployment rates. The unemployment rate fell from 6.3% when Biden took office in January 2021 to 3.9% by the end of 2021, reflecting a robust recovery that outpaced many expectations. This economic resurgence was largely fueled by the administration's aggressive stimulus measures, particularly the American Rescue Plan Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I mentioned earlier. The American Rescue Plan's infusion into the economy provided critical financial assistance to individuals and businesses, while the Infrastructure Act's $1.2 trillion investment laid the groundwork for both immediate job creation and long-term economic growth by modernizing key sectors like transportation and broadband. However, despite the achievements, the economic recovery has faced criticism due to the rising inflation that has eroded purchasing power and led many Americans to feel disconnected from the broader economic gains. Inflation, driven by supply chain disruptions, high consumer demand, and global factors such as energy price spikes, reached levels not seen in decades, peaking at 9.1% in June 2022. As a result, even though wages have risen and the economy is objectively performing well with low unemployment and strong job creation, the increased cost of living has offset these gains for many Americans. This has led to a sense of economic unease as people understandably feel the pinch in their daily lives. No matter how strong the economy may be on paper, the impact of inflation means that many Americans justifiably perceive the economy as struggling. The CHIPS Act is one of the most significant pieces of legislation passed during Biden's presidency, ranking among the monumental achievements that I mentioned earlier. This act represents a crucial investment in securing America's technological future and economic independence. The CHIPS Act provides $52 billion to boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing, an industry critical to nearly every modern technological device, from smartphones and cars to advanced military systems. The act seeks to reduce the United States' reliance on semiconductor production from TSMC in Taiwan, which currently dominates global production. Given the geopolitical tensions and the strategic importance of Taiwan, having domestic manufacturing capabilities is vital. Geopolitics aside, the pandemic made it clear that overdependence on foreign suppliers, especially in essential industries like semiconductors, can lead to significant disruptions. Diversifying supply chains is necessary to combat this over-reliance in an interconnected world. Companies like Intel, Samsung, and TSMC are ramping up their operations in the US, with new semiconductor fabrication plants being built in states like Arizona and Texas. The Act also includes significant investments in R&D, which is crucial for maintaining the US's competitive edge in technology. The Inflation Reduction Act is the cornerstone legislation of the Biden administration, and it represents one of the most ambitious efforts to address climate change, healthcare costs, and fiscal responsibility in recent U.S. history. This act stands out as a monumental investment in clean energy and climate action, with $369 billion allocated to various energy, security, and climate change initiatives. The IRA claims to significantly cut greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, positioning the U.S. as a leader in the global fight against climate change. One of the key aspects of the IRA is its focus on expanding clean energy production and adoption. The Act provides substantial tax incentives and credits designed to catalyze investment in renewable energy projects like solar and wind. These incentives are aimed not only at large-scale energy producers, but also at smaller community-based initiatives, making clean energy more accessible across the board. For example, homeowners can benefit from tax credits for installing solar panels, while businesses can take advantage of incentives for large renewable energy installations. The IRA also extends these benefits to emerging technologies such as geothermal energy and advanced battery storage, ensuring that the energy grid becomes more resilient and sustainable over time. In addition to renewable energy, the IRA invests heavily in the EV market. It includes provisions that offer tax credits for consumers purchasing new and used EVs, making them more affordable for everyday Americans. Furthermore, the IRA encourages the development of domestic supply chains for critical EV components like batteries to reduce dependency on foreign sources and bolster American manufacturing. Energy efficiency is another major focus of the IRA. The Act provides incentives for upgrading homes and buildings to be more energy efficient, from installing better insulation to adopting high-efficiency appliances and HVAC systems. By improving energy efficiency, the IRA aims to reduce overall energy consumption, which not only helps the environment by lowering emissions, but also saves consumers money on their utility bills. Together, these initiatives initiatives represent a comprehensive strategy to transition the U.S. to a low-carbon economy. By making clean energy technologies more accessible and affordable, the IRA seeks to reduce the nation's reliance on fossil fuels, which is essential for cutting emissions at a time when urgent climate action is needed. These investments are designed to create a ripple effect, driving innovation, creating jobs, and settling the U.S. on a path to become a global leader in clean energy technology. In addition to its environmental goals, the IRA addresses one of the most pressing issues in healthcare: the high cost of prescription drugs. The Act grants Medicare the power to negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies, a significant shift that is expected to lower the cost of medications for millions of Americans. This provision alone is a historic win for healthcare reform, as it aims to reduce out-of-pocket expenses for seniors and make life-saving drugs more affordable. Also, the IRA includes measures to lower the federal deficit through corporate tax reform. By imposing a minimum corporate tax rate of 15% on large corporations, the Act seeks to ensure that profitable companies pay their fair share in taxes. This not only helps to fund the IRA's climate and healthcare initiatives, but also contributes to reducing the federal deficit. Overall, the Inflation Reduction Act is a comprehensive and far-reaching piece of legislation that addresses multiple critical issues facing the country. Its focus on clean energy, healthcare cost reduction, and fiscal responsibility makes it one of the most significant legislative achievements of the Biden administration, with the potential to shape the nation's future for decades to come. I've spent some time highlighting Biden's achievements, however, that's far from the whole picture. While Biden has certainly made some positive strides, he's also been responsible for significant, costly, and often hypocritical missteps that cannot be overlooked. When considering the full scope of his presidency, I believe he ranks among the worst presidents we've had. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was intended to end America's longest war, but instead it became a symbol of failure. Biden's decision to pull U.S. troops out without adequate planning or coordination led to the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban's swift return to power. The chaotic scenes at Kabul's airport, where desperate Afghans clung to departing planes, were broadcast worldwide, leaving a stain on America's reputation. Moreover, the abandonment of Afghan allies, many of whom have risked their lives to support U.S. forces, was seen as a betrayal that would have long-lasting consequences. This withdrawal not only cost lives, but also seriously damaged America's standing on the global stage, making it harder for future administrations to build trust with international partners. Yes, America should have withdrawn from Afghanistan long ago. And yes, perhaps we should not have been there in the first place. Actually, we definitely shouldn't have been there in the first place. But how this withdrawal was executed was deeply flawed and has left a stain on America's reputation. I think it's important to note a couple of things here. First, it was Trump's deal with the Taliban in Doha that put us in this situation, and both he and Biden share blame. Trump's fault lies in striking a badly negotiated deal with a fixed withdrawal date and sidelining the Afghan government entirely. Biden, on the other hand, took that flawed agreement and ran with it, executing the withdrawal in a disastrous and embarrassing way.
They couldn't stop the process. They wanted to, but it was very tough to stop the process.
I want to make clear, the blame is not pulling out from the war, but rather leaving those who fought for the US recklessly and endangering lives with no regard for humanity. It was probably always going to be somewhat chaotic, but there is no excuse for the actual catastrophe that took place. It just shows a blatant disregard for human life on all levels. Joe Biden went back on his promises to the Afghani people, who were left there to face the consequences of the United States' actions. In early 2022, there were opportunities to de-escalate the Russia-Ukraine conflict through diplomacy, with peace talks in Belarus and Istanbul showing promising signs of compromise. However, instead of seizing the moment for peace, Biden doubled down on rejecting any sentiment of it. One example was sending Boris Johnson to Kyiv to deliver a clear message to Zelensky: reject any peace agreements and keep fighting, with promises of unwavering Western support. This intervention contributed to prolonging the conflict, leaving Ukraine increasingly reliant on foreign military and financial aid, while deepening the devastation of the war.
Борис Джонсон до Києва і сказав, що ми взагалі не будемо з ними нічого підписувати, і давайте будемо просто воювати.
פועל על דעת עצמי. כל פעולה שעשיתי הייתה מתואמת לפרטי פרטים, גם עם ארצות הברית, גם עם גרמניה, גם עם צרפת.
אז הם בעצם חדלו את זה?
בגדול, כן. בגדול הם חדלו את זה, ובאותו זמן חשבתי שהם שוגים. בדיעבד, מוקדם לדעת. אני טוען שבסבירות לא רעה אפשר היה להגיע.
אם הם לא חודלים את זה?
אם הם לא חודלים, לא בטוח.
At the same time, the sweeping sanctions imposed on Russia were expected to isolate its economy and cripple its ability to continue the war. Instead, they backfired in many respects, accelerating de-dollarization and prompting countries like India to purchase Russian oil using Russian rubles and China to settle trade in Chinese yuan, thus bypassing the dollar altogether. These sanctions, designed to harm Russia, began to have ripple effects across global markets. As one analysis noted, previous efforts to cut countries out of global systems have targeted much smaller economies like Venezuela, North Korea, and Iran. Doing the same for a large player like Russia requires sanctions that will bite the sanctioner as much as the sanctionee. The economic blowback on Western economies, coupled with energy shortages and soaring prices, show how these sanctions have created more global instability rather than achieving their intended objectives. It also demonstrates that the weaponization of the dollar is something that the US should not misuse, as it is our greatest tool and a huge contributor to our unipolar superpower status.
How concerned are you about the potential impact of the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency?
Man, I've been getting the money, that bag just been calling, no reason. I'm back on my back in my zone again, back in my home again, back on my throne again, not letting go. Back on my own again, getting this dough again, man, I got so much more money to show.
While the Biden administration has made significant strides in advancing climate initiatives, the administration's environmental record is marred by troubling contradictions.
Number one, no more subsidies for fossil fuel industry, no more drilling on federal lands, no more drilling including offshore, no ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. Ends. Number one.
Despite campaign promises to halt offshore drilling and stop new drilling on federal lands, Biden's administration has approved over 6,400 permits for oil and gas drilling on public lands during its first 2 years, outpacing even the Trump administration in this regard. This includes significant new projects like the Willow Project in Alaska, which was greenlit by Biden's administration despite strong opposition from environmental groups. The Willow Project alone is expected to produce more than 600 million barrels of oil over its lifetime, which could result in the emissions of millions of tons of carbon dioxide. The surge in drilling approvals has drawn sharp criticism from environmental groups and climate activists. According to Taylor McKinnon, a senior public lands campaigner at the Center for Biological Diversity, Biden's runaway drilling approvals are a spectacular failure of climate leadership. McKinnon further stated, avoiding catastrophic climate change requires ending new fossil fuel extraction, but Biden is racing in the opposite direction. The contradiction between Biden's climate rhetoric and the reality of his administration's actions underscores a significant tension within his presidency. Environmental groups argue that these actions are not only inconsistent with Biden's stated climate goals, but also risk locking in decades of continued carbon emissions at a time when the world needs to be rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuels. While the administration has defended these approvals by pointing to legal obligations and the need to stabilize energy prices amid global crisis, the decision to continue and even expand fossil fuel drilling on public lands raises serious concerns about the administration's commitment to ending the fossil fuel era. Biden's immigration policies reflect a departure from his campaign promises. Immigration has been one of the defining issues of President Biden's presidency. Despite presenting himself as a compassionate alternative to his predecessor, Biden's immigration policies have often mirrored, and in some cases intensified, the strictness of prior approaches. In the 2023 fiscal year, ICE reported over 142,000 removals and returns, nearly double the previous year's total. This includes almost 18,000 families, a figure that exceeds those seen under the previous administration. These numbers highlight a significant shift from Biden's campaign promises of a more humane immigration system. Instead of implementing the compassionate reforms he advocated for, his administration has continued and intensified enforcement practices that were previously criticized. A key aspect of this enforcement is the increased use of returns over formal removals. There's some context here when talking about Biden's deportations. While removals involve formal deportation orders with legal consequences and penalties for re-entry, returns are less formal processes where migrants are sent back without without such orders. This distinction is important because returns lack the deterrent effect of formal removals and do not carry the same legal weight, potentially undermining the long-term effectiveness of border enforcement, but also in a way distorting the numbers in some sense. It's not necessarily untrue that Biden had similar or more deportations than Trump, but there should be context when distinguishing returns and removals. Moreover, Biden has taken significant steps to tighten asylum policies, which contradicts the narrative that he is pursuing a more compassionate approach. After the expiration of Title 42 in May 2023, which was a public health order initially used to expedite expulsions at the border, Biden's administration implemented new asylum rules that make it significantly more difficult for migrants to seek refuge in the United States. These rules disqualify many migrants if they did not first seek asylum in another country they passed through, echoing policies from the previous administrations. At the same time, the perception of an open border, fueled by inconsistent enforcement and policy changes, has contributed to unprecedented levels of migrant crossings. This surge has overwhelmed resources and created complex humanitarian challenges at the border. The administration's policies, which simultaneously implement stricter asylum rules and harsher policies while struggling to manage the increased number of arrivals, have led to criticism from multiple perspectives. Biden is doing both too much and not enough. I think it's also important to point out here, there was a harsher border bill proposed that was shot down by the House and Senate Republicans. But ultimately, Biden's approach to immigration reveals a disconnect between his campaign rhetoric and the policies implemented under his administration. The increased reliance on returns over formal removals, combined with stricter asylum policies, suggests a shift towards more restrictive measures. The broader immigration discourse within the Democratic Party has also evolved, with many prominent figures adopting more strict stances. It remains uncertain whether there will be a renewed focus on humane immigration policies moving forward. Even VP Kamala Harris sounds more and more like Trump every day.
But you do want to build some wall.
I want to strengthen our border.
Democrats used to be the party of mocking and criticizing things like building the wall. That was a huge thing for the Democrats to campaign on. Build the wall was seen as a racist joke, essentially. Now, Democrats want to literally build the wall and are bragging about parts that Obama had built previously.
They built cages. You know, they used to say, I built the cages. And then they had a picture in a certain newspaper. And it was a picture of these horrible cages. And they said, look at these cages. President Trump built them. And then it was determined they were built in 2014. That was him. They did it, changed the policy.
Your response
they
to that?
They did it. We changed.
did not
They built the
separate
cages.
the
Who built the cages, Joe?
Let's talk about what
Who
we're
built the
talking about.
cages,
Let's
Joe?
talk about what we're talking about.
During his campaign, Joe Biden criticized the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, arguing that they were harmful to the American consumers and did little to address the root issues in the US-China trade relationship. Actually, that they would harm the US-China trade relationship.
Some have said Trump's stance is a good one to counter China's influence. Would you keep the tariffs?
No, hey, look, who said Trump's idea is a good one? Who said Trump's idea is a good one?
Some feel that...
2 or 3 people. We're going after China in the wrong way.
However, once Biden was in office, he not only maintained these tariffs, but expanded them even further, increasing the economic pressure on China in a move that has intensified tensions between the two nations. Biden has quadrupled tariffs on Chinese-made EVs, tripled those on steel and aluminum, and doubled duties on semiconductors. It also signals a willingness to embrace the same protectionist and confrontational tactics that have historically strained international relations, raising concerns about the future of US diplomacy. Biden's decision to follow and expand upon Trump's hardline trade policies represents a missed opportunity for a more balanced and forward-thinking strategy. While protecting US interests is crucial and avoiding a second so-called China shock is necessary, this approach could have been executed with greater emphasis on diplomacy and collaboration. A more nuanced strategy might have better safeguarded national security while avoiding the pitfalls of deepening an unnecessary rivalry with China. This is just one aspect considered a failure of the broader US containment strategy towards China, which is seen increasingly as ineffective and hostile. One of the most egregious actions taken by Biden's administration has been its active role in undermining democracy in Pakistan. Prime Minister Imran Khan, a leader who was democratically elected, beloved and respected by the Pakistani people, was unjustly removed from power and jailed on bogus charges in military courts, orchestrated by the Pakistani military with the full knowledge, approval, and suggestion of the Biden administration. This intervention stands as a blatant betrayal of the democratic principles that the U.S. so often claims to champion. Rather than respecting the democratic will of the vast majority of Pakistani people, the Biden administration chose to side with fascist elements within Pakistan's military. The removal of Imran's government and his unjust detention was not just an attack on one man. It was an attack on the very foundation of democracy in Pakistan. The consequences for Pakistan have been devastating. The military's brutal crackdown on peaceful protests, the unjust imprisonment of political opponents and any who oppose the military, and the ruthless censorship of the media have plunged the country into a dark chapter of repression. Women, children, and ordinary civilians have all suffered under this oppressive regime, while the Biden administration has remained conspicuously silent. Matthew Miller from the State Department, otherwise known as Smiling Satan himself, has repeatedly called this an internal matter regarding a private citizen when referring to former Prime Minister Imran Khan.
Cipher was reality. The U.S. officials was giving a demarche. So now you have a former Prime Minister, the military chiefs were sitting. So is the responsibility going on President Biden wanting to change the regime in Pakistan, or the secretary? I mean, somebody has to take at least.
I feel like I need to bring just a sign that I can hold up in response to this question to say that allegation is not true. I don't know how many times I can say it. I will say, as I've said before, that the United States does not have a position on one political candidate or party versus another in Pakistan or in any other country.
I mean, for the love of God, imagine evidence comes out, a cipher is leaked, it's all out in the open, yet you laugh about being asked the question so many times and say we don't interfere and the allegations are not true. I wish I could hold up a sign that says it because I'm asked so much. But unfortunately, that sums up the Biden administration in a nutshell. That is how the Biden administration has dealt with Pakistan and the oppression of its people and the brutal crackdowns, laughing, denying, and turning a blind eye. Then they wonder why Pakistani organizations endorse Trump. Instead of condemning these gross violations of human rights, the U.S. has continued to support the illegitimate government installed by the military, turning a blind eye to the suffering of the Pakistani people. The U.S. then supported some of the worst, most shameful degrees of election rigging seen in any country in decades. This betrayal by the U.S. is not only hypocritical, it is a direct violation of the democratic ideals that should guide international relations, the democratic ideals that our country says guides our foreign policy.
But it feels like election rigging of this level would merit sanctions. If a Maduro-like government did something like this, it would seem like the State Department might come down a little harder. This is 250 million person democracy.
And we will continue to support democratic suppression and a vibrant democracy in Pakistan, but I don't have anything to preview from here.
You just said you will continue to support democratic suppression.
I said expression.
Oh,
expression.
By aligning itself with a corrupt military establishment against a democratically elected leader, Biden's administration has shown a willingness to disregard the aspirations of millions of Pakistanis and betray what America stands for in favor of maintaining its geopolitical interests. The repercussions of this betrayal are profound. Pakistan, a nation that has always strived for democracy despite immense challenges, is now more oppressed and destabilized than ever. The U.S.'s actions have eroded trust and fostered widespread resentment among the Pakistani people, who now see the U.S. not as a partner in democracy, but as a supporter of tyranny. However, I want to make it clear that blaming solely the U.S. is misguided. The true enemy of the Pakistani people is the entrenched military institution and the corrupt army generals, such as Asim Munir, who have long plundered the nation's wealth and suppressed its citizens. This institution has consistently undermined democracy and has operated as a de facto government in Pakistan, manipulating civilian governments to serve its interests. It is this system, more than any foreign interference, that has kept Pakistan from realizing its full potential. While Biden's administration bears some responsibility, it is a corrupt system within Pakistan that remains the greatest obstacle to the country's progress and well-being of its people. However, the U.S. can't help themselves when it comes to overthrowing popular elected governments in favor of dictatorships that they can influence, and it is one of the more despicable acts Biden has conducted and continues to support during his term. The Biden administration's handling of Pakistan is a direct continuation of America's long-standing pattern of undermining democracy whenever it serves U.S. interests. This is not the first time that the U.S. has intervened in Pakistan's democratic process by supporting an army chief over a popularly elected leader, but it should be the last. America has consistently aligned itself with Pakistan's military dictators, from General Ayub Khan in the 1960s to General Zia Haq in the 80s and General Musharraf in the 2000s. The Biden administration's actions reflect the same disregard for the aspirations of the Pakistani people, continuing a legacy that prioritizes expedience and control over democracy and self-determination. This must end. Pakistan's future cannot be dictated by generals. The Biden administration's handling of Pakistan has been nothing short of reckless and destructive, actively suffocating democratic progress. Rather than supporting free elections and empowering civilian leadership, the U.S. has enabled authoritarian interests, further entrenching military control at the expense of the people's will. In doing so, it has abandoned any pretense of advocating for democracy, choosing instead to back corrupt alliances and subvert political movements and crack down on political dissent that seek genuine representation. This administration's approach isn't just misguided, it's criminal. Currently, the people of Pakistan are fighting for their democracy with bravery and vigor, and the Biden-Harris administration supports and continues to support their brutal oppressors. Now let's move on to the truly unforgivable, Gaza. Under Biden's administration, the U.S. has provided unwavering support to Israel, leading to devastating consequences for the Palestinian people. We have spent $18 billion on Israel since October 7th, 2023. This support has facilitated the indiscriminate killings of civilians, including women and children. At least 42,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel since October 7th, if not closer to 200,000, according to a recent Lancet study. The advanced weaponry supplied by the U.S., including precision-guided bombs, has enabled Israel to carry out a brutal campaign that has obliterated entire neighborhoods, reduced hospitals to rubble, and transformed schools into graveyards. The horrors inflicted go beyond just numbers. They include the use of white phosphorus, which can continue to burn inside flesh and burn skin to the bone. It also causes horrific pain and life-changing injuries and cannot be put out with water. It's a war crime. Israel also bombs UN-designated shelters where civilians seek refuge. These actions are not just failures of leadership, they are grotesque betrayals of basic human values. The United States' role in these war crimes will forever stain Biden's presidency as well as America's moral standing in the world. The administration has given Israel near unlimited access to military resources, effectively allowing them to carry out their objectives without regard for the human cost. The weapons provided by the US have been used in some of the most unthinkable acts of violence, costing countless civilian lives. Israeli forces have used attack dogs against civilians, and there have been brutal rapes committed by soldiers, adding to the sheer horror experienced by the Palestinian population. The IDF are a bunch of serial rapists and murderers. They always have been. This isn't about isolated incidents. It's a systematic campaign of destruction made possible by US support. By continuing to supply these weapons and unconditional support, Biden has ensured that the violence will continue, with devastating consequences for the Palestinian people. Biden's so-called red lines on Israel's actions have been nothing but empty rhetoric. He repeatedly claimed that there were limits to US support, lines that Israel should not cross. Yet, time and time again, those red lines have been flagrantly violated without any consequence. Take the case of the Rafah border crossing, the only point of exit for Gazans into Egypt. Despite Biden's assertions that civilian access must be preserved, the crossing has been bombed multiple times, trapping thousands of civilians in a war zone. Each time, Biden did nothing, proving that his red lines were mere illusions easily erased whenever Netanyahu decided to push them. Worse, the Biden administration has repeatedly used the US veto to block resolutions at the United Nations, making the US the sole obstacle to peace efforts. This veto was not an anomaly, but part of a long-standing pattern. The US has vetoed 45 resolutions critical of Israel, comprising more than half of its 89 total votes since 1945. Of these, 33 targeted Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories or its treatment of Palestinians. The US's first pro-Israel veto came in 1972, and between 82 and 90 alone, it exercised this power 21 times, nearly half of all such vetoes. Since 2001, 21, it has issued 14 more. These vetoes aren't just diplomatic maneuvers, they're direct endorsements of the ongoing atrocities in Gaza. The message is clear. The United States values its strategic alliance with Israel more than the lives of innocent Palestinians. The other message is also clear. This cannot and would not happen without United States' full support and approval. The current administration has also supported the ongoing economic blockade of Gaza, which has devastated the lives of ordinary Palestinians. With over 80% of the population relying on international aid to survive, the blockade has turned Gaza into what the UN has called an open-air prison. Despite multiple calls from international organizations to end or ease the blockade, the Biden administration had failed to pressure Israel to lift these restrictions. The blockade is a weapon of war, and the US's inaction effectively endorses it. Ahmed Khan, a committed philanthropist with a long track record of helping deliver aid to war-torn regions, said, "I've organized airlifts of women legislators, judges, and journalists out of Afghanistan as Kabul fell, delivered ongoing aid to Ukrainian frontline villages during Russia's invasion, worked on efforts to build runways, roads, and highways to deliver aid to Rwandan refugees after the genocide, and delivered aid shipments to enclaves besieged and under attack by the Syrian army. None of it prepared me for the challenges of trying to bring a few trucks of food and medicine per week into the Gaza Strip. It's easy to point the finger at Israel, the country that is implementing the blockade of Gaza's 2.3 million residents, half of whom are children. Yet trying to work the issue from every angle on a daily basis to get urgent medical and food aid in, I've come to the conclusion that President Joe Biden, for whom I hosted fundraisers and worked to elect in 2020, has signed on to Israel's end goal of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. The Biden administration isn't just complicit by refusing to condemn Israel's blockade of humanitarian aid, an absurd situation leading the US to incur significant costs and unnecessary risks for symbolic airdrops. He's actively supporting Israel's oft-stated but ill-defined war aim of eradicating Hamas, a military effort with little concern for Palestinian lives or the fate of Israel's hostages held in Gaza. Ignoring the growing international outcry, Biden has largely dismissed appeals to intervene and stop the bloodshed in Gaza. Leaders from around the world, including Pope Francis and the UN Secretary General, have urged the US to use its influence to broker a ceasefire and facilitate humanitarian aid. Yet, Biden has maintained his unwavering support for Israel. The recent UN General Assembly resolution calling for Israel to end its occupation of Palestinian territories within 12 months, though largely symbolic, further highlights the US's isolation. With overwhelming global support, the resolution reflects a growing frustration with Israel's actions, but it lacks legal enforceability due to the opposition strictly from the US. The resolution serves as another reminder that meaningful progress is unlikely without US cooperation, showcasing how the administration's continued inaction not only prolongs the suffering, but also weakens multilateral efforts to resolve the conflict. Also, I wouldn't even call it inaction. I would call it action, just in the negative direction, purposefully using action to prolong Israel's atrocities towards the Palestinian people. The administration has also tried to silence or discredit human rights organizations that have documented Israeli abuses in Gaza. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have released damning reports detailing Israeli violations of international law. Instead of addressing these concerns, the Biden administration has sought to undermine the credibility of these organizations, dismissing their findings and attempting to control the narrative. This is the opposite of putting human rights at the center of US foreign policy, which Biden proudly stated and promised he would do. It's not as though the US is unaware of the violations taking place. The State Department's own 2023 country report on human rights practices outlines many of these abuses in detail. The report discusses specific instances of arbitrary killings, collective punishment, inhumane conditions for detainees, and the use of excessive force by Israeli authorities in Gaza. It highlights the use of administrative detention, forced demolitions, and the mistreatment of Palestinian detainees, often with no legal recourse for the victims. I encourage people to read it and know what Biden and Harris are aware of every time either of them says that they're with Israel no matter what. Anytime either of them say we are with Israel with ironclad support. Anytime Harris says that we're working around the clock tirelessly for a ceasefire. Know exactly that they are well aware of the atrocities taking place and that have been taking place, that they support it, that they fund it, that they know exactly what is happening, and there is no working around the clock for a ceasefire. There is no any of that. This is full endorsement and sponsorship from Biden and Harris. Biden, Harris, Blinken, and Matthew Miller and most of the Democratic Party are monsters who support this barbaric regime knowingly. This documentation from the State Department demonstrates that the Biden administration is very well aware of the severe human rights violations that are taking place, but still fails to act meaningfully or hold Israel accountable for engaging in any of these documented violations that they documented. By undermining the findings of groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and opposing ICC investigations, the US ensures that these abuses are not meaningfully addressed. This selective engagement with human rights organizations allows the administration to maintain diplomatic cover for Israel while the suffering in Gaza continues uninterrupted. The contradictions between rhetoric and practice are very clear. Human rights matter only when aligned with strategic interests. Biden has continued the US policy of undermining the ICC, particularly in its investigations into potential war crimes committed by Israel. Despite the ICC's mandate to investigate and prosecute those responsible for the gravest offenses, such as Netanyahu, the Biden administration has actively opposed the court's efforts to hold Israeli officials accountable. This undermining of the ICC provides cover for those responsible for atrocities in Gaza, ensuring they will never face justice. At the same time, the administration has selectively embraced the ICC in its investigations of Russia, particularly regarding Vladimir Putin's war crimes in Ukraine. The US supported the ICC's arrest warrant for Putin, signaling its willingness to leverage the court as a diplomatic tool when it serves the US strategic interests. This selective engagement with the ICC demonstrates another double standard. While the US undermines the court when it investigates allies like Israel, it champions the court when its actions align with American foreign policy objectives, such as countering Russian aggression in Ukraine. Biden's actions haven't been limited to direct support of Israel. They've also involved targeting those who speak out against these policies. The administration has cracked down on Palestinian solidarity movements within the US, increasing surveillance and disrupting the activities of pro-Palestinian organizations. Activists have been labeled as security threats, and many have faced legal challenges aimed at silencing their advocacy. This crackdown on free speech and assembly that Biden is sponsoring is a direct attack on American democratic principles and serves to further silence those advocating for justice in Gaza. Also, Biden's administration has backed legislation that conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, attempting to silence the legitimate discourse on Palestinian rights. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act has been used to delegitimize and shut down criticism of Israeli policies on college campuses and beyond, stifling free speech and dissent. This legislation, framed as protecting Jewish communities from hate, has been widely criticized for conflating legitimate criticism of Israel with hate speech, making it a tool for silencing dissent rather than protecting minorities. Also, this is a complete violation of the First Amendment and uses hate speech as a tool for silencing those who are standing up for liberation. The administration also baselessly suspended aid to the UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, the agency responsible for providing vital services to Palestinian refugees. This aid suspension was essentially a form of collective punishment, leaving millions of Palestinians without access to food, healthcare, and education. The suspension of aid has been condemned by the international community as it exacerbates the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and further demonstrates the administration's disregard for Palestinian lives. Finally, it's impossible to ignore the humiliating dynamic between Biden and Netanyahu. Despite Biden's public posturing, Netanyahu has treated him like a child, consistently lying and going back on promises, all while continuing his aggressive policies without fear of reprisal. Biden has looked like an idiot at every turn, and his so-called strategic diplomacy was revealed as nothing more than blind obedience to Netanyahu's agenda. The famous bear hug strategy that Biden was attempting did not work at all. Biden's administration regularly tries to leak that he's fed up with Netanyahu, and it is pathetic. Biden and Harris both lie about ceasefire intentions while sending Israel more weapons. That is evil. The Biden administration's actions in Gaza amount to an enabling of an ongoing genocide. As the world watches in horror, the US continues to supply Israel with the resources it needs to carry out its campaign of ethnic cleansing. This is not a policy failure. It is a moral failure of the highest order. The complicity in these atrocities will be remembered as one of the darkest chapters in American history. Biden's legacy will forever be tainted by his role in defending a genocidal campaign against a defenseless population. The ongoing genocide in Gaza, enabled by US support, will be a stain on America's conscience that will never be erased. Biden's legacy is Gaza, and it will be a dark, permanent mark in history. His presidency will be remembered not for his early achievements or legislative efforts, but rather for his unyielding support of Israel's brutal actions in Gaza. Biden's failure to hold Israel accountable for its war crimes, his blind endorsement of their genocidal campaign, and his administration's active participation in silencing dissent will be the defining features of his time in office. This is the legacy he leaves behind. A legacy of complicity in mass atrocities and moral bankruptcy. While some may attempt to salvage his image by pointing to the positive aspects of his administration, these efforts are futile. The horrors inflicted on the Palestinian people, made possible by Biden's unwavering support, overshadowed any good he may have done. His name will forever be associated with the devastation of Gaza, and history will judge him accordingly. Biden's presidency could have been defined by progress and compassion, but instead, it will be remembered for the bloodshed that he enabled. The damage he has done to America's moral standing on the global stage is irreparable, and the scars left by his actions will not soon fade. History will judge him not as a protector of human rights, but as a president who sacrificed lives and moral integrity for power. Biden's name will be synonymous with failure, betrayal, and an unforgivable disregard for human suffering. He will be remembered as Genocide Joe, the butcher of Gaza.